Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me here at the Leibniz-Institut. It's a great honour to be invited. Thank you for having me here, and thanks particularly, Martina, for the leadership that you've shown already in this this domain of research that you're undertaking as part of this research group. I already feel quite at home here, actually. So I consider myself as pathologically interdisciplinary in that I can't seem to stay put in any one particular place, which my background actually is in urban ecology, so thinking about nature and cities, and have moved around into the environmental social sciences and increasingly thinking about these dimensions of inner transformations and the inner dimensions of what this sustainability agenda really looks like, which is what I'll be talking today about in this talk, which I've titled Inner Transformations for Sustainability, Just Imagine, and that will become clear in a few slides why I titled it in this way. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the planet is in a real crisis, and I'm speaking here to people who acutely recognize this, but I think we're starting to see increasingly the realized effects of climate change and biodiversity loss. Even just this year, there's a litany of terrible tragedies, such as heat waves in India with loss of life and crop failure. In my hometown in Sydney, Australia, just a couple of weeks ago, we've seen record-breaking floods in urban areas. And then I've just come from the UK, where the all-time heat record has been broken, with days passing 40 degrees in the UK, which is quite frightening. And I think this opens up new sorts of questions that we need to be grappling with, which are not simply, what is the scientific evidence that we require here, but what kind of questions does this open up around what it means to be human, and how do we bring questions of humanity to the fore? And so I want to start just with a quote that I found quite pertinent by Professor Mike Hume, who's a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge. And he says that when we talk about climate change, and I'd say this would be true for any environmental issue here, we should not start with the latest predictions from the climate models, nor whether we've passed some sort of catastrophic tipping point, nor whether the IPCC should be trusted. We should start by thinking about what it means to be human. What is a good life, and therefore, what is an adequate response to climate change? So this is where I want to position the talk today, and I'm acutely aware that some of the ideas that we're going to be exploring are somewhat beyond the realms of conventional science, but I would argue that they ought to be core to the kind of initiatives that we're exploring here within this field. So I'll start with the concept of transformation, or transformations for sustainability. And I'm encouraged to hear that this already is a topic that's of interest here within the Institute, so I won't labour the point too much. But just to set the scene, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Earth is on a deeply unsustainable trajectory, to the point where we're looking at the fracturing and destabilisation of fundamental Earth systems. And so some frightening statistics are that only approximately 1 in 10 of the global goals, whether that be biodiversity goals, SDGs, have been met so far since the original Stockholm meeting in 1972. And so we're certainly on the wrong trajectory. And what this leads us to conclude, or has certainly led the scholarly community as a whole to conclude, is that we need not just incremental change, but wholesale transformation. And in the Stockholm Plus 50 report recently, the conclusion was that only system-wide transformation will enable humanity to achieve well-being for all within the Earth's finite capacity to provide resources and absorb human waste. And that transformation, which is what we're talking about, involves a fundamental system-wide shift in worldviews and values, and in the technological, economic, and social organization of society. So we're very much reaching into this domain of subjective experiences, intangible dimensions such as worldviews and values. One metaphor or heuristic that I've found quite helpful in my own work is that of leverage points. And albeit this is very much a mechanistic metaphor, which breaks down when pushed too far, but I think what it does do is help us to ask questions of where should we be intervening or acting for change in a way that will actually precipitate the kind of transformative change that's required. And so there's a recognition that conventionally we've focused on what might be called shallow leverage points. And these ideas were put forward initially by the systems thinker Donella Meadows and has been taken further in recent years. But the shallow leverage points might be considered things like material flow. So I don't know how much energy are we actually consuming, or and interventions might be taxes or incentives to try and tweak those parameters, whether that be taxes on certain food products or so forth. But the deeper leverage points are the norms, the values, and the goals that are embedded within the system of interest. And these are the deepest, but they're also the hardest to change. So if we're thinking about a food system, for example, it's not just how much carbon is emitted for the production of a certain number of kilojoules of energy. It's actually food cultures. It's about what do we look for in food? Is it about meaning? Is it about nutrition? Is it about convenience? These are the goals which drive the whole food system. And these are I would say, the deep leverage points that we urgently need to start paying attention to. But it's very easy to keep these very analytical and scientific in the way that we frame them. But I suggest that we need to go deeper than that. And I share this quote from the Kenyan activist Elizabeth Wapiti from Kenya, who gave an address at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow just last year to the plenary. And she said as follows. She said that my truth will only land if you have the grace to fully listen. My story will only move you if you can open up your heart. I can urge you to act at the pace and skill necessary, but in the end, your will to act must come from deep within. And I think this resonates with all of us on a human level. We recognize that our actions come from often inner sources of commitment or motivation. So the question, therefore, is how do we access this domain of human experience and connect this to the transformation agenda? So there are a few cross-cutting questions which I'll be exploring today in this talk, and the broad concept here is inner transformations. So what, firstly, are such inner transformations, and what do they then offer to the field of sustainability? What are some misconceptions that will need addressing? And I just hinted a few which we've started observing in the literature recently. And finally, what does this mean for urban planning and practice? And that final point is very much some thoughts in their infancy that I'll offer here, and I look forward to kind of working through some of these in the workshop this week. So very quickly, to begin with, what are inner transitions or transformations? And just to say, I'll use those terms interchangeably today. I personally prefer transformations because it suggests a more radical kind of change, but I'm happy for them to be interchanged. There have been a number of publications that have started to come out, and some of these have even been cited in the most recent IPCC set of reports, which is encouraging to see. But in essence, this idea of inner transformations, I like this quote or this definition that is provided by Christine Barnsler and others. This new perspective views climate change as a human problem that's intrinsically linked to other crises. And here it's rooted in internal mental states. And this can, as I'll show, this can exist at different scales. So it's not only individual. And some colleagues and I suggested that our inner lives underpin external change. And this is the idea that our inner lives include things like our mental models, which actually underpin a lot of the way that systems work. So really, when we're talking about inner transformations, it's around grappling with these kinds of things. So today I've structured the talk around this acronym, IMAGINE, and it's my attempt to offer a few points as to how we might access this domain of inner transformations as I suppose a budding, nascent research agenda. So we're going to look at 6 things here. So firstly, the I and the M, the integration of inner and outer and individual and collective phenomena, and the mobilization of transformative change. These two are kind of the foundation of this idea of inner transformations, and they're really kind of ontological assertions about inner lives, systems, and the nature of change. We'll then look at the activation of existing values and the generation of new inner resources, which these second two are more about how change happens, kind of breaking open this idea of change from the inside out. And then the final two, the inclusion of diverse perspectives, often those who are not conventionally included in scientific discourse, and the expansion of knowledge for sustainability are kind of implications around this inner perspective on sustainability. So let's go through our IMAGINE acronym. So firstly, integration. A lot of some recent papers have thought about inner transformations as being purely individual. So it's about hyper-individualism is one form of critique that it's received. And what I want to argue is that no, we need to understand inner transformations from an integral perspective. So Ken Wilber's integral model I've found quite useful, which kind of breaks up reality into 4 different quadrants across 2 different axes. The first axis is the individual through to collective, and the interior through to exterior. So the individual and interior is particularly this domain of inner transitions around thoughts, emotions, memories, states of mind, perceptions, and sensations. And I would say the inner transformations also encompasses the intersubjective, or the we, which is shared values and meanings. Whereas we have tended in sustainability science to focus here on the exterior dimensions, so the objective and the interobjective. What does this mean? In the case of climate change, for example, if we start with the individual external, so we might ask a question like how much carbon is captured in the permafrost. When you expand that to the collective domain, we might think about, what's the effect of climate change on this and what kind of feedbacks exist within the Earth system, but that's still very much external. Whereas the interior questions are things like the societal internal questions, what are the implications of a post-truth culture in addressing climate change? And this one, which has particularly received scant attention, is that inner domain. So what is the inner basis for tackling action? How can we as individuals tap into inner resources to mobilize change? So the integrated perspective, which is really the foundation, is about holding together this inner and outer. And I think already, I know that the work that you're doing as part of this research team has worked with this. So, if you think about food, food is not just calories or materials that we consume, it's about cultures. It's embodied, there are meanings and practices, and that's of course inner and outer. And then of course individual and collective as well needs to be held together. And so one example might be, it's not so much an environmental context, but Leeds in the UK has declared itself a compassionate city. So this is a way of kind of bringing these interior ideas of values into the collective, and they're working through this around, poverty truth commissions and enabling people who are struggling with poverty to engage in decision making and actually bring those issues to bear through this lens of compassion. So inner and outer and individual and collective need to be held together. So the next letter is mobilization. So this is about the nature of change and specifically the role of inner dimensions in this. Typically, we've thought within the sustainability sciences and sustainability scholarship as about change, mostly in one of 2 ways. So it can be the kind of the individual pro-environmental behavior lens, and this is very much rooted in psychology, and there's a lot of agency given to individuals, and it's all about nudging behaviors and looking for incentives and that kind of thing. The critique obviously is it doesn't often adopt a systemic societal lens to thinking about behavior, and I know that's one of the things that we really need to grapple with from sustainability. Or you come at it from a sort of power and structure systemic perspective. So you'll often think about this as the agency versus power kind of tension. But I would argue that and this when we think about change in this sense, we look at agitation for change with social movements and such. Both are important and necessary, but I'd say neither of those really tap into some of the deeper dimensions here, which I think are really important. And some of the questions I would like to see advanced then as part of this inner transformations agenda is, what are the deep values and paradigms that characterize both institutions and organizations and individuals, and how do these change over time? What processes of reinforcement or resistance of deeply held values exist between individuals and their groups? What are the inner sources of motivation that drive individuals to initiate structural change? So structural change, if it happens, often has individuals involved who are compelled by beliefs and values that they hold. And finally, what are the kind of inner sources of strength and resilience that allow individuals to sustain change in the face of opposition, and how can these be cultivated? Oh, and finally, what beliefs and values shape what is understood as ethical processes of change for sustainability? We could talk about this for a long time, so we haven't really got all that time this morning to do so, but I think these are the kinds of questions that I think have been really neglected. I want to point to just one example of how the connection between values, beliefs, worldviews, and change, which is the quite well publicized Green Belt movement led by Wangari Maathai in Kenya, and has become sort of a global movement. It was around planting trees, combating soil erosion, all these kind of external things, which are wonderful, transforming landscapes, transforming lives in the process. But when asked about the source of motivation for this, Maathai pointed to 4 core values of the movement, which were love, not just concern for, but love for the environment, gratitude and respect for Earth's resources, self-empowerment, and the spirit of service and volunteerism. And her conclusion was that she was convinced that the organization, the Green Belt movement, couldn't have survived and thrived without embedding these values at its core. So as I say, this idea of structural change and individual agency needs to have these kinds of inner dimensions part of the picture. So that's the I and the M. The A for activation. This is, now we're going to look at kind of how does change happen, and how do we start mobilizing action from the inside out? Again, I'm just going to point to sort of 2 areas that I think are interesting in this regard. First is this idea of values that really are latent, that underlie a lot of there's potential for change from these values that exist. So some research from Europe has shown that that by and large people hold, and this is in an individual sense, hold compassionate or environmentally oriented values fairly high in their self-assessment, but that this differs from how others consider people's values. Does that make sense? There's a disconnect here. So it's Bowman and Stegg just wrote a couple of years ago that contrary to popular belief, individuals, groups, and society rather strongly endorse biospheric values, which has great potential in motivating and accelerating pro-environmental change. Yet individuals structurally underestimate the biospheric values of others, which could hold them back from taking action. And so in this case, what we need to do is not so much, the misconception is often that this inner transformation is sort of social engineering. It's about changing people's values. And I think this, not social engineering, there's a dimension of truth in that, but actually very, very often it's about activating and mobilizing existing values that are often constrained. But this isn't just in the West. A colleague of mine, Kasia Mikulovic, has done research for her PhD in the Amazon. So entirely different ecological, economic, and social context. She did work with farming communities, particularly around sort of ranching communities there, but was interested in how they valued nature and were connected to nature in a whilst their practices are actually leading to the destruction of the Amazon rainforest in many cases. what she found was that respondents largely aligned with pro-conservation attitudes. And so when asked questions about the degree to which they prioritize nature or want to prevent extinctions, the vast majority were very affirmative towards those kinds of responses, as was the case with protecting forests. Perhaps less so with tolerating pests like snakes and other carnivores for good reason. But there was underlying this a kind of strong environmental concern. And these pro-conservation attitudes were related to transcendental values, whether they be, interestingly, traditional or universal sorts of values. But I think the key point I want to raise here is that economically poorer respondents tended to prioritize development over nature. So it wasn't that they didn't care about nature. It was actually their material poverty was limiting these latent values for being fully expressed. So I think there's something here around the idea of, as I say, mobilizing latent values. And this has been picked up in the recent Ives report on values, the values assessment, which was launched just a couple of weeks ago. And they say that policies, they were trying to take this and connect it to the policy landscape. Policies can ensure that conditions exist for people to prioritize existing but latent sustainability aligned values. And that this is a deep leverage point. And they say that existing sustainability aligned values can be supported by governance structures that create opportunities to give voice to and act upon these values through processes of deliberation and citizen engagement. So there's an activation of values here. The next one on the cab off the rank is the generation of new resources. So whilst the previous point was about sort of activating latent potential, here we're going to be thinking about the tools and resources that we might be able to use to drive change, and perhaps the new qualities that are needed. So I think there is a need to focus on the qualities of a sustainable life and the inner resources to get there. So I think we need to create spaces where we can ask questions and deeply interrogate how we should be in the world as it currently is, which is really looking at ourselves. And then how do we become the kinds of people that can authentically live in harmony with the planet? So this is sort of the change, the inner change that might be necessary. And I'm very much sympathetic to this sort of re-emergence of virtue ethics and a greater attention being paid to qualities of the human life that might encompass what it means to live well, which is beyond just hedonic sorts of understandings of well-being. So this is things like, how do we reclaim wisdom, humility, integrity, courage, faith, hope, and even love, and bring those to bear in our own lives and within the institutions that we exist. And we're seeing this being picked up, probably less so in the scientific literature, but more within more action-oriented initiatives, such as the mindfulness initiative, which is in the UK, connected to, there's an all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness, which is speaking and offering insight for the UK Parliament. They're thinking about mindfulness and what that can offer to tackling pressing societal challenges, including the climate crisis. And they conclude that the relevance of mindfulness and compassion practices are really vital in addressing this. So I think these are ancient practices that actually offer some clues as to the way that we can live differently as individuals, as people. It's been picked up within the Transition Towns Network, which is now an international network around this idea of inner transitions, and recognizing, again, we as individuals have something to bring to these challenges of sustainability. The other one I want to point to is the inner development goals, which have been recently developed. Thinking about we don't just need these external SDGs with indicators on sort of external change. We need internal indicators of the kind of change that's necessary, and critically the capabilities and capacities that can be cultivated to develop this. And they have organized these capabilities according to 5 different domains of being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. And they have as I say, developed goals and practices that can cultivate those. And then the last piece of research that I want to point to is a project that I've recently just wrapped up, which is looking at within faith communities in the UK, Christian communities, how an intervention, which is a text for the period of Lent, the Christian period of Lent, which is focused entirely on kind of connecting Christian beliefs and values to environmental sustainability issues. I was interested in the kind of impact that might have on believers' attitudes, values, and behaviours towards the planet. So not people engage with the book here through reading it, but also through practices of prayer, engagement in digital media, and discussion, deliberation within groups. And I can go into more detail about this project if you like, but I won't go into the nuts and bolts of it. But what we found was that there seemed to be a kind of model of change which was emerging, which went from revealing kind of the nature or the extent of people's beliefs, actually interrogating, reflecting on those. And so revealing current beliefs and putting those next to revelations of the planetary crisis as well, so the science of that, through to a process of, and this was key, the reflection. So there was an openness, there was deliberation about this, and then depending on where people were, there was either a kind of redirection into new behaviours and actually new beliefs, and some of these were kind of quite fundamental ontological beliefs about the nature of God and concern for the planet. And actually a reduction in anthropocentric beliefs is what we observed qualitatively. But in some cases as well, there was a reinforcement of this. It's like, well, I already had these concerns, but now I'm increasingly motivated and compelled to live a lifestyle that is in keeping with them. And I think what we found is that this loop might be especially important for activating change within faith communities because of, we talk a lot about, how do we bring about change rather than how do we sustain change, and the kind of community dimension of sustaining pro-environmental change, I think, is really key. So this is kind of an example of what it might mean to develop new resources and inner qualities for change. Then finally, the last couple is the implications of this inner transformation agenda. So firstly, I'd like to say there's a need then for greater inclusion of different perspectives on change and action. And so it means being inclusive and ethical. And so again, back to the Ives values assessment, which I think picks up on a lot of the sorts of themes I've been pondering for a little while anyway. They say that most policy making has prioritized a narrow set of values, which has very much been reductionistic and from the Western scientific discourse, rather than thinking about other voices, particularly Indigenous perspectives and local communities that bring often vastly different worldviews and commitments. And so there is a need to balance and mobilize values through participatory processes that can envisage alternative futures. So I think it basically means we need to open up what is seen as legitimate within this sustainability agenda. So it's not only science. An example of what this might look like is this rights of nature movement, where we've seen the connection of vastly different worldviews to the policy and decision-making space. So we've seen this in New Zealand with the Wanganui River, which was granted legal personhood in 2017 based on notions of sacredness that the Maori people held. And also in Colombia, the Atrato River, where the Constitutional Court recognized it as a legal subject at a similar time. So I think these are indicators of what it might look like to include different perspectives. I mean, these can be critiqued as well around, whether this is just superficial legal language and whether or not it actually goes deep enough into activating real change. But I think it's a move in the right direction. And finally, so rather than just including diverse perspectives, or maybe actually as a result of that, we lead to an expansion of what is seen as knowledge and action for sustainability. Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher, wrote about the with the rise of modern science and technology, argue that there's been a disconnection of action from contemplation, which in many traditions has always been held together. And she said particularly this idea of action. So not only has there been a disconnection of action from contemplation, when we talk about action, the good of any action is defined very narrowly based on what she termed fabrication, which is the production of output, rather than seeing action as freedom, and particularly action as having moral virtue in and of itself. And I think this is, I would say, really important for us when we're thinking about sustainability, where it's often very difficult to see and measure the direct impact of our actions on any sort of substantial planetary response. But understanding action as carrying moral weight and significance in and of itself, I think, is something that needs to be reclaimed. And I share this quote from the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, who captures this really nicely. He says that he who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening his, or I would say his or her own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love, will not have anything to give others. And I think we need to look at, really, when we take action or try to mobilize action in various different spheres, to what degree is that being grounded in these kinds of qualities, particularly qualities of love. I think this has potential to be really transformative. So that's imagine. So what might this look like for urban planning and practice? And I feel like this is a massive leap to a different domain, but I think this maybe is a really interesting space to start pressing into then. From a foundational point of view, I think this has to have something to do with reconnecting to nature. So, and when I say reconnecting to nature, I don't mean just in some sort of a understanding or knowledge, cognitive sense of understanding nature, or even a psychological one. I think we need to understand this as having both individual and societal dimensions, and spanning from internal to external domains, in keeping with Wilber's integral model. And so it means about our philosophical positioning of ourselves, understanding sort of ontologies of what it means to be human in relation to nature, all the way through to sort of emotional connections to the natural world, cognitive understandings of nature, how we engage with an embodied sense in natural environments, and the sort of material consumption that we have, or that we engage in, and how that impacts practically and physically on nature. So reconnecting needs to be a broad agenda. So the way that might translate to outcomes and actions might be things like practices of community gardening, which I understand we're going to have some nice engagement with over the next couple of days, and more sort of embodied forms of education, through to, as I say, new contemplative practices that engage with nature in ways that maybe have been neglected. One example that I think has potential here is the design of spaces in cities to provide access to nature that enables opportunities for people to perhaps untap some of those contemplative possibilities. And so here's an example of a sensory garden at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, which has been done to do just that. There are other forms of, how do we think about agriculture and meditation together? So yogic farming is one example with the Brahma Kumaris, who they're engaging in farming practices and connecting that to their spirituality. And, it doesn't need to look like that in every setting, but I think, why do we seem to keep spirituality separate from food production or other kind of practical practices? And finally, another good example, I think, is a charity in Liverpool in the UK, which I recently came across, which is an interfaith charity. So they're working with faith groups in particular, but they are happy to, they very much emphasize the spiritual and moral dimensions of environmental action. And because of that explicit attention to faith, spirituality, and religion, they're able to bring together much more disparate communities. And there's been examples of Muslim and Christian and some Eastern religious communities coming together, working on projects. And then, because they've been mobilized, this organization is able to connect them with government actors as well, looking at sort of restoration of riparian zones along rivers. And they've got a really nice example of a community garden, again, in a sort of churchyard, but that's building social capital within marginalized communities within the city as well. So I think it just opens up new realms of possibility. And I think this is an exciting and potentially fruitful domain for future research. So to wrap up, let's go back to our IMAGINE acronym. I argue that these inner transformations for sustainability offer us new potential for different kinds, not just more and more transformative action, but different qualities of action which have been long neglected. So it's grounded in an integration of inner and outer and individual and collective phenomena. So it brings a much more holistic understanding of change and looks at mobilization of transformative change from that integrated place. It allows us to consider how we might activate latent potential for change and generate new resources to bring it about. It makes us think, therefore, also about the different voices and perspectives that we include and how we might expand knowledge for a sustainable, just and flourishing future. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for listening, and I appreciate your time this morning.